My name is Lorraine. I am 62 years old, and my occupation is a retired head nurse. I spent my entire life building a kingdom for my only son, handing him the keys to a debt-free life while I worked my fingers to the bone. But the moment his new wife decided I was no longer useful, he looked me dead in the eye and told me to never contact them again. He thought he held all the power when he walked away, but he forgot one crucial detail about the very ground he was standing on. For decades after my husband passed away, my life was nothing but 12-hour night shifts at the hospital. I was a proud, hard-working woman determined to give my boy Jamal the world. I missed Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, and church picnics, saving every single penny so he could graduate college without a dime of debt and start his own marketing firm. Jamal was my pride and joy, the very beat of my heart. The exhaustion of being a widow was heavy, but seeing him succeed made every swollen ankle and sleepless night worth it. I truly believed our bond was unbreakable, but that beautiful illusion shattered into a million pieces on a Tuesday afternoon. I was standing on the front porch, holding a basket of folded laundry and a warm pan of peach cobbler I had just baked for them. Jamal stood at the bottom of the steps. His wife, Jessica, was clutching his arm, wearing a smug, tight-lipped smile and refusing to even look in my direction. Jamal would not even step onto the porch. He looked up at me, his eyes colder than I had ever seen them. He took a deep breath and said, "Jessica is my future mum. You are suffocating us. Until you can respect her boundaries, do not call me. Do not come by. We are done." The words hit my chest like a physical blow. I stood there frozen, the heavy basket digging into my waist. I watched my own flesh and blood turn his back on me, help his wife into their car, and drive away. They left me stranded in the chilling silence of the neighborhood, holding a pie for a son who had just ripped my heart out. The pain was blinding. I had sacrificed my youth and my comfort for 35 years, only to be discarded the second a manipulative woman decided I was in her way. Let me take you back to the beginning to explain how deep this betrayal truly cut. When my husband passed away from a sudden heart attack, Jamal was just 7 years old. The world felt like it had completely collapsed on my shoulders. I was a young widow with a heavy mortgage, a mountain of sudden medical bills, and a terrified little boy who needed his mother more than ever. I refused to let grief swallow us whole. I wiped my tears, put on my nursing scrubs, and marched straight into the hospital. For the next 2 decades, I practically lived on the surgical floor. I took on every double shift, overnight shift, and holiday shift I could find. While other mothers were carving warm turkeys on Thanksgiving, or watching their children open gifts on Christmas morning, I was monitoring vital signs and comforting sick patients, praying to God that my sacrifice would pay off. I stretched every single dollar until it screamed. I bought my own clothes from thrift store clearance racks and ate cheap oatmeal for dinner, just so Jamal could have fresh fruit, good meat, and proper basketball shoes. I was terrified of the streets claiming my beautiful black boy. I kept his schedule packed tight with sports tutoring and church youth groups. I made absolutely sure he stayed focused on his future. When it was time for him to go to college, I sat him down at our small kitchen table and told him he would not take out a single student loan. I drained my early retirement funds and picked up even more shifts. I paid every tuition bill in full, semester after semester. Because of that grueling work, Jamal graduated completely debt-free. He was able to take career risks that other young men simply could not afford to take. He launched his own marketing firm right out of school and built a successful business. I was so incredibly proud of him. He was my ultimate masterpiece. I truly thought my hardest days as a mother were finally behind me, and that we had made it to the finish line together. About 5 years ago, Jamal's marketing business really started to take off, and he decided he was ready to buy his dream home. It was a beautiful four-bedroom property in a very quiet, upscale suburban neighborhood. But the housing market at the time was absolutely brutal. Interest rates were sky high, and the banks were making it incredibly difficult for a young, self-employed entrepreneur to secure a fair and reasonable mortgage. I could not stand to see his dreams slip away after he had worked so hard. I wanted to give him a solid foundation, something permanent that no one could take from him. So I stepped in to help. I took the bulk of my life savings and the untouched remainder of my late husband's life insurance policy, and I purchased the house outright in cash. However, I did not just hand him the deed like a careless lottery ticket. As an experienced mother, I knew he still needed to build strong financial discipline. I went to my lawyer and set up a family limited liability company called Legacy Horizon. Legacy Horizon legally bought the property. I drew up a formal agreement where Jamal would pay his monthly mortgage directly to my company. In reality, he was simply paying back the principal balance with absolutely zero interest. It was my way of protecting the family wealth while teaching him long-term responsibility. Every single month, his payment went straight into a dedicated savings account that I fully intended to give right back to him and his future children one day. He knew the exact arrangement. He was incredibly grateful, and he agreed to it without hesitation. He moved in, painted the walls, planted a garden, and proudly called it his own. Then Jessica entered the picture, and everything began to shift. When Jamal first brought her home to meet me, she seemed like a genuinely lovely young woman. She had a bright smile, said all the right things, and constantly praised my cooking. I was so deeply thrilled that my son had found someone to love and share his life with. But shortly after their lavish wedding, the sweet mask she wore began to slip, revealing a very cold and calculating reality underneath. It started with subtle little microaggressions that I tried my absolute hardest to brush off for the sake of peace. When I lovingly brought over my famous smothered chicken and collard greens, she would literally turn up her nose, claiming she only consumed organic plant-based meals now. I once watched her scrape my homemade food straight into the garbage disposal, while I was still sitting right there at the kitchen table. She also started making snide, elitist comments about my lifelong friends from church. She called us unnecessarily loud and said our joyous gatherings lacked proper social etiquette. Slowly but surely, I watched her strategically isolate Jamal from his own community. He stopped coming to Sunday service with me. He completely stopped attending our annual neighborhood block parties. Every single time I invited him over, Jessica suddenly had a convenient excuse for why they could not make it. She was systematically cutting the deep ties between my son and his cultural roots, quietly molding him into someone I barely recognized anymore. I bit my tongue raw and kept my mouth shut, praying it was just a temporary adjustment phase. I constantly reminded myself that mothers eventually have to let go. But the heavy knot in my stomach told me something much darker was brewing inside that house. The true depth of Jessica's cruelty finally showed its face when my grandson, little Jordan, was born. I was practically bursting with joy, ready to step in and help them navigate those sleepless nights, just like the grandmothers in my family had done for generations. But instead of being welcomed into my son's home, I was treated like an infectious disease. Jessica started imposing these ridiculous, rigid rules whenever I wanted to see my own flesh and blood. I was not allowed to kiss the baby on his cheeks. I had to wash my hands with a specific surgical grade soap she bought online and wear a medical mask inside their house, even though absolutely no one else had to. If I spoke too loudly or sang my old church hymns to him, she would snatch him right out of my arms, claiming I was overstimulating his developing nervous system. I watched in absolute agony as Jessica's parents came and went as they pleased, holding Jordan, taking him for walks, and enjoying all the beautiful privileges of being grandparents without a single restriction or complaint. But my visits were strictly limited to 1 hour every other Sunday. heavily monitored by Jessica as if I were a criminal on parole. It broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. I tried to talk to Jamal about it, begging him to see how unfair and deeply hurtful this was. But my strong, independent son had been completely brainwashed. He would just repeat these cold, robotic phrases that Jessica clearly fed him from her internet psychology articles. He would look at me with blank eyes and say they were just setting healthy boundaries to protect their peace from toxic family dynamics. Toxic. Me. The woman who wiped his tears, paid his college tuition, and bought the very roof over his head. I was suddenly labelled toxic simply because I wanted to hold my grandson and love him the way a grandmother should. Jamal stood by silently while his wife systematically erased me from their lives, treating me like a contaminated stranger rather than the matriarch who built the foundation they were standing on. I swallowed my pride week after week, forcing a smile during my brief allotted hours, just so I could catch a fleeting glimpse of little Jordan's sweet face. While I was being actively pushed out the back door, Jessica was rolling out the red carpet for her older brother Todd. Todd was a flashy, loud, deeply entitled white man who moved through the world like he owned it, despite never actually working an honest day in his life. He drove a pristine, leased Porsche that he could not afford and wore tailored designer suits, paid for by credit cards, maxed out to their absolute limits. Todd was a serial grifter constantly bouncing from one disastrous cryptocurrency venture to another shady real estate scheme, leaving a trail of ruined investors and unpaid bills in his wake. Yet to hear Jessica tell it, Todd was the next great American business genius. She worshipped the ground her brother walked on and constantly compared Jamal to him. It made my blood boil to sit at their dinner table and listen to Jessica undermine my son's steady, legitimate marketing business while praising Todd's imaginary empires. She would casually drop comments about how Todd had real vision and how Jamal needed to think bigger if they were ever going to reach true wealth. The reality was that Todd was drowning in a massive ocean of debt, and his latest crypto platform had just collapsed, leaving him exposed to serious legal trouble. But he kept up the grand facade of extreme wealth, showing up at family gatherings with expensive bottles of wine and loudly bragging about phantom investments that never actually materialized. Jamal, eager to please his wife and desperate for the approval of his new in-laws, started looking up to Todd. He started treating this con artist like a trusted mentor. I tried to warn Jamal. I pulled him aside one afternoon and told him that a man who wears a $5,000 watch but cannot pay his own rent is not a man you take financial advice from. I begged him to keep his business accounts completely separate and to protect the solid assets I had helped him build over the years. But Jamal just rolled his eyes, telling me I was old-fashioned and did not understand how modern wealth generation worked. He defended Todd fiercely, claiming his brother-in-law was just going through a temporary cash flow issue. What Jamal did not realize was that Todd's cash flow issue was about to become our family's absolute worst nightmare. Jessica had no intention of letting her precious brother face the consequences of his own reckless greed, and she had already set her sights on the biggest pile of equity she could find. The devastating truth finally came to light during a tense Thanksgiving dinner at Jamal's house. I was already walking on eggshells, trying my best to follow all of Jessica's exhausting rules, just to spend a few precious hours with my grandson. The house was loud with Jessica's extended family, and Todd was holding court in the living room, bragging loudly about a new commercial development project. We needed an extra chair for the dining table, so I quietly slipped down the hallway toward Jamal's home office to grab one. As I reached for the brass doorknob, I heard hushed, panicked voices coming from inside. It was Jessica and Todd. I stopped dead in my tracks and pressed my ear against the cool wood of the door. Todd sounded absolutely desperate, his usual arrogant tone completely gone. He said he needed $300,000 immediately to cover his tracks and avoid total bankruptcy or worse, federal charges. He was practically begging his sister for a financial lifeline. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird as I waited for Jessica to tell him they could not possibly afford that. Instead, her response chilled me straight to the bone. She told him to calm down, her voice dripping with cold calculation. "Do not worry," she promised him. "I am making Jamal take out a home equity loan. We will pull the cash straight out of the house. We just need to get his mother out of the picture first, so she does not ruin it." I had to press my trembling hand over my mouth to stop myself from gasping out loud. They were planning to leverage the home I bought, the home paid for by my late husband's life insurance, to bail out a con artist. And Jessica was planning to completely eliminate me from Jamal's life, just to ensure her fraudulent scheme went off without a hitch. I did not wait for dinner to be served. I pushed the office door open, walked straight in, and looked both of them dead in the eye. Jessica went completely pale, and Todd awkwardly backed away toward the window like a frightened animal. I demanded that Jamal come into the room immediately. When my son walked in, I told him exactly what I had just heard. I laid out their entire disgusting scheme, warning him that his wife was actively planning to gut his home equity to save her fraudulent brother from federal prison. I expected Jamal to be outraged. I expected him to kick Todd out of the house and fiercely protect his family. But before Jamal could even process my words, Jessica collapsed to the floor in a theatrical fit of hysterical tears. She began sobbing wildly, clutching her chest and crying that I was a paranoid, jealous old woman who was trying to destroy her marriage. She claimed I had been creeping around, eavesdropping and twisting their innocent conversation about a potential business partnership into something malicious. Jamal rushed to his wife, wrapping his arms around her as she wept perfectly timed tears onto his shirt. He looked up at me, his face twisted with pure fury, and fiercely defended her. He accused me of being hateful, crazy, and desperate for control. He screamed that Todd was family and that I was trying to drive a wedge between them because I could not stand seeing him happy with another woman. I stood there stunned, watching my son choose a beautifully wrapped lie over the mother who gave him absolutely everything. That bitter confrontation led directly to that agonizing Tuesday afternoon on my front porch. Jamal needed to prove his absolute loyalty to Jessica, and she demanded a permanent sacrifice. That was when he looked at me with cold eyes, told me I was suffocating them, and banished me from his life. He verbally disowned me to protect the very people who were actively robbing him blind. For 2 solid weeks, after my own son banished me from his porch, I lived in absolute darkness. I drew all the heavy curtains in my house, took the landline phone off the hook, and just sat in my worn-out rocking chair weeping until my eyes were swollen shut and my throat was completely raw. The silence of my empty house was deafening. I mourned the loss of my son, Jamal, the boy I had given my entire youth to raise. I mourned the loss of my sweet grandson, little Jordan, who would now grow up thinking his grandmother did not love him enough to stay in his life. I felt like a hollow shell of a woman. I had spent 35 years pouring every ounce of my love, my money and my soul into my family, only to be tossed out like yesterday's garbage the moment I became inconvenient to a manipulative daughter-in-law. I remembered the cold winter nights I walked to the bus stop after a 12-hour shift just to save gas money. I remembered eating leftover hospital cafeteria food so Jamal could have fresh groceries. But grief is a funny, unpredictable thing. Eventually, your body simply runs out of tears, and the sorrow begins to calcify into something much harder. On the 15th morning, I woke up, walked into my living room, and stared at the framed photograph of my late husband sitting on the mantel. I looked at his kind eyes, and then I looked down at my own hands. My hands were calloused and scarred from decades of grueling nursing shifts. They were the hands of a woman who had fought tooth and nail to build a lasting legacy out of pure ashes. Suddenly, the crushing weight of my sorrow evaporated, and in its place, a righteous burning anger took root deep in my chest. I wiped my face and stood up straight. I realized I did not survive the heartbreaking exhaustion of early widowhood poverty and relentless labor just to let an entitled, ungrateful daughter-in-law and her grifter brother steal the very foundation I built. I refused to let my late husband's life insurance be completely liquidated to fund Todd's criminal lifestyle. Jamal might have chosen his new wife over his mother, but he had severely underestimated the resilient black woman who raised him. I was not going to crawl away quietly and hide in the shadows while they robbed my family blind. It was time for me to take my power back. I washed my face, put on my best church suit, and drove straight to the downtown office of my longtime family attorney, Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling was a sharp, no-nonsense man who had been my trusted advisor for years. He was the one who had helped me set up the Legacy Horizon Company 5 years earlier, when I first bought the beautiful suburban house for Jamal. I sat across his heavy mahogany desk, my hands folded neatly in my lap, and calmly explained everything that had happened. I told him about the horrifying conversation I overheard on Thanksgiving, Jessica's manipulative tears, Jamal's ultimate betrayal, and their frantic, desperate plan to pull $300,000 of equity out of the property to bail Todd out of his massive debts. Mr. Sterling listened quietly, his fingers steepled together before pulling up the thick legal files for the property. He made a few quick phone calls to his secure contacts in the local banking sector to see if Jamal had actually initiated the loan process. The answer we received was both shocking and incredibly validating. Jamal and Jessica had indeed fast-tracked an application for a massive home equity line of credit. They were moving at lightning speed, desperate to get that cash into Todd's hands before his financial house of cards completely collapsed. Because Jamal had been the one physically writing the monthly checks for the property taxes and making his regular payments to my company, he and Jessica automatically assumed his name was the only one on the official deed. They thought they had total ownership and absolute control over the asset. But they were arrogant, and in their blind arrogance, they had forgotten one crucial legally binding detail. When I originally purchased that beautiful home in cash, Jamal was so eager to move in and start his new life that he never actually signed a formal deed transfer. The property was never put into his name, not even partially. Legally, the house belonged 100% to Legacy Horizon, which meant it belonged entirely to me. Mr. Sterling smiled a very tight, knowing smile, and informed me that the bank's underwriting department had already flagged Jamal's loan application internally. The title search showed clearly that Jamal was not the legal owner of the property. Jamal and Jessica were currently living in a house they did not own, trying to borrow against equity they did not possess. They had built their entire malicious plan on a fragile foundation of lies, completely oblivious to the fact that I held the absolute master key to their financial destruction. Hearing this, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. I was not just a heartbroken mother anymore. I was the landlord, the legal owner, and the sole protector of my family's hard-earned wealth. Any normal person would have immediately called the bank and shut the fraudulent loan application down, right then and there. But I was completely done playing nice, and I was certainly done protecting a son who had so callously thrown me away like a stray dog. I looked at Mr. Sterling and told him we were not going to stop the bank just yet. Instead, we hatched a brilliant plan to let Jamal and Jessica believe their scheme was proceeding perfectly smoothly. We wanted them to feel confident to walk right up to the finish line, completely unaware that they were stepping directly into a steel trap of their own making. While we waited for the bank to schedule their final closing date, I took some of my own retirement savings and hired a top-tier private investigator to dig deeply into Todd's supposedly glamorous life. I needed concrete proof of exactly where my hard-earned money was supposed to be going. Within a matter of days, the investigator handed me a thick, damning folder that confirmed my absolute worst fears. It turned out Todd was not just bad at business. He was a dangerous criminal. He was currently under active covert investigation by federal authorities for massive wire fraud and operating a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to very dangerous, angry investors who were ready to see him locked away. If Jamal had somehow managed to get that $300,000 loan and transferred it into Todd's accounts, my son would have instantly become a legal accessory to federal wire fraud. Jessica was so desperately obsessed with saving her brother that she was perfectly willing to drag her own husband into a federal indictment just to cover Todd's tracks. The absolute pure evil of her manipulations made my stomach turn. Jamal was an absolute fool for blindly trusting them, but I was not going to let him destroy his permanent record and his freedom over a lie. I had the investigator compile every single piece of evidence, every court document, and every financial record proving Todd's impending arrest. Then I turned back to Mr. Sterling and gave him my final heartbreaking directive. I instructed him to draft a formal, legally binding 30-day notice of eviction for Jamal and Jessica. It was the hardest decision I had ever made in my entire life, signing a paper to kick my own flesh and blood out of his home. My hand trembled violently as I held the heavy pen, and a single tear dropped onto the legal paper. But my resolve did not waver for a second. They wanted to treat me like a stranger, so I was finally going to act like one. I had built the castle, and now I was pulling up the drawbridge. I was ready to drop the ultimate hammer and let them face the brutal consequences of their own actions. It was a crisp Thursday morning when the trap finally snapped shut. Jamal, Jessica, and Todd were sitting in a pristine glass conference room at the downtown branch of the First National Bank. I knew exactly where they were, because my lawyer, Mr. Sterling, had been closely monitoring the loan application through his contacts in the underwriting department. The three of them were sitting around a polished oak table, laughing loudly and drinking complimentary sparkling water, waiting eagerly for the final paperwork to be brought in. Todd was wearing one of his cheap but flashy tailored suits, already acting like the $300,000 check was sitting comfortably in his back pocket. Jessica was absolutely glowing, holding my son's hand and playing the part of the deeply supportive, loving wife. They were practically celebrating, whispering to each other about how incredibly easy it was to outsmart the system and secure the cash. Jamal looked so proud, completely blind to the fact that he was about to sign away his entire future for a man who would throw him to the wolves without a second thought. They were just waiting for the loan officer to give them the green light. But the loan officer did not walk in with a stack of papers and a pen. Instead, the heavy glass door of the conference room swung open, and the room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. I walked in wearing my favorite tailored navy blue suit and my pearls, walking with my head held high and my shoulders pulled back. Mr. Sterling walked closely beside me, carrying a thick leather briefcase. The smug, victorious smile instantly vanished from Jessica's face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Todd choked on his sparkling water, his eyes darting toward the exit like a trapped rat looking for a way out. Jamal just stared at me, his jaw practically hitting the floor. He stammered out a confused question, asking what on earth I was doing there, and demanding that I leave before I ruined his important business meeting. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at the son I had sacrificed everything for, pulled out a heavy leather chair directly across from him, and sat down at the head of the table. I looked directly at the loan officer who was standing awkwardly by the door and politely informed him that this closing was officially cancelled because the man sitting at the table had zero legal authority to borrow against the property. Jamal's face turned completely red with embarrassment and anger. He slammed his hand hard on the table, shouting that I was crazy and that he was the rightful owner of the house. That was when I gave Mr. Sterling the nod. My lawyer opened his briefcase and pulled out the original certified property deed. I took the heavy document and dropped it right in the center of the table. It landed with a loud, satisfying thud. I told Jamal to look closely at the paperwork. I told him to read the name of the legal owner out loud. He leaned over his eyes, scanning the page, and all the color completely drained from his face as he saw the name, Legacy Horizon. I spoke with a chilling, absolute calm. I explained to the room that my company bought the house in cash 5 years ago. And because Jamal never signed a transfer agreement, he was nothing more than a glorified tenant. He owned absolutely nothing. Jessica gasped loudly, grabbing the paper from his hands and reading it frantically. I then turned my attention to Todd, who was sweating heavily. I reached into my purse and pulled out the thick folder my private investigator had compiled. I slid it aggressively across the polished wood until it hit Todd's trembling hands. I announced loudly for the loan officer and everyone else to hear that Todd was currently under active federal investigation for wire fraud and operating a massive Ponzi scheme. I looked right at Jamal and told him that his precious wife had manipulated him into committing a federal crime just to bail out her criminal brother. If he had signed those papers and given Todd that money, he would be going to federal prison right alongside him. Jamal turned to Jessica in absolute shock, desperately asking her if it was true. Jessica could not even look him in the eye. She just sat there, trembling and speechless, her entire web of lies completely exposed under the bright fluorescent lights of the bank. But I was not finished. I reached into my purse one last time and pulled out a crisp, neatly folded legal document. I looked directly into Jessica's terrified eyes and slid the paper directly to her side of the table. It was a legally binding 30-day notice of eviction. I told her she had exactly 1 month to pack her bags and get out of my house. Jamal sat completely frozen, his arrogance crumbling into absolute panic as the heavy realization finally washed over him. He finally understood that his manipulative wife had completely used him, and he had thrown away the only woman who genuinely protected him. The fallout from that day in the bank was fast and absolutely brutal. Just 1 week later, federal agents raided Todd's rented apartment and arrested him on multiple counts of wire fraud. He was denied bail and went straight to a federal holding facility. Jessica, realizing that Jamal had absolutely no assets to his name and could no longer provide the luxurious, entitled lifestyle she demanded, packed her bags and abandoned him before the 30-day eviction notice even expired. She filed for divorce, leaving him sitting alone in an empty house he did not own. Jamal was completely broken, both financially and spiritually. He showed up at my front door on a rainy Tuesday evening, crying uncontrollably and begging for my forgiveness. He told me he was so incredibly sorry that he had been blind and foolish to choose her over me, and he begged me to let him come back home. Looking at my son, standing there in the rain, my heart definitely ached. A mother's love never truly goes away, but my unwavering boundaries had finally been set in stone. I told him I loved him, but I refused to be his blind safety net ever again. I allowed him to move into a small, modest apartment building that I owned across town, charging him full market rent. He had to start over from scratch, learning the hard way how to stand on his own 2 feet, without my money cushioning his fall. I told him he would have to earn back my trust over time, day by day, action by action. It was the hardest lesson I ever had to teach him, but it was the only way to help him become a real man. Looking back on everything that happened, I realize now that a mother's love is truly unconditional, but her financial support and her self-respect absolutely cannot be. For decades, I thought being a good mother meant giving my son everything, shielding him from every hardship, and handing him the world on a silver platter. But I was wrong. Cutting that financial cord was the single most painful thing I have ever done, but it was the only way to save my own life and force Jamal to finally become a real man. Today, I have completely reclaimed my peace. I spend my days traveling to places I only ever dreamed of seeing when I was working those long hospital shifts. I host joyous dinners with my loud, beautiful church friends, filling my home with laughter and genuine love. I am no longer just a sacrificed widow or a discarded mother. I am a woman who knows her worth. To all the beautiful mothers and grandmothers listening to my story right now, I want you to remember this. Never let your deep love for your children blind you to your own worth. Always keep the absolute keys to your own castle, because nobody will protect your legacy quite like you will. If you have ever had to set a hard, painful boundary with a child you loved just to save yourself, please let me know your story in the comments below. We need to support each other through these difficult seasons. Tell me, where are you listening from today, and what time is it there in your part of the world? Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with a strong queen who really needs to hear it today. Keep your head held high, protect your peace, and stay blessed.